Hi, my name's Dr. Daniel Duke and I'm from Monash University in Melbourne, Australia. And I'm here to talk today about high-fidelity simulations of multi-component pressurised metered dose inhaler sprays. I'd like to begin by acknowledging my co-author, Professor David Schmidt from the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and also acknowledge funding support from both Chiesi Limited and the Australian Research Council. So, the first question that we might want to ask is, why are we modelling a PMDI? Well, we know that flow inside the actuator and in the spray, and the development of the spray really drives the particle formation process. And if we could understand it, then we might be able to predict what kind of particle formation distribution and fine particle fraction we would get for a given formulation and actuator. And this would make prototyping much easier. The problem is that the quantities of greatest interest that we need to measure, like composition, temperature and density, they're very, very difficult to measure inside or close to the nozzle where the physics really are driving this process. However, over the last sort of 5 years, I've spent a lot of effort attempting to do this. And so we've, for example, developed these very nice X-ray images shown here in false color of the flow inside and in the actuator orifice. We can also undertake optical based measurements in our lab, high-speed images of the spray plume itself. And we can measure things like density and the structure of the spray doing this. But for example, temperature or composition, we can't measure. That's much more difficult. And so there are some things that we just can't yet measure. However, if we could simulate the spray, we would know all of these things, and we could then attempt to predict the size distribution and the fine particle dose, for example, in software. And this would make prototyping much easier and would enable us to optimize the geometry of an actuator for a given formulation as a package. And so this would then be able to be done at much lower cost than repeated laboratory testing. We start with a three-dimensional model of a Bespak actuator, a standard 0.3 millimeter nozzle orifice. We could use any geometry, but we're using a standard one that we have lab data for. And then we use what we call a homogeneous relaxation phase change model. And don't worry, I'm not going to go through all this maths, but I'd be happy to answer questions about it. What I'm going to do today is just tell you the key features and how it works. So it's built on OpenFOAM, which is an open source computational fluid dynamics package, but it's an in-house solver that we've developed ourselves. It doesn't model the individual droplets or gas-liquid interfaces to save computational cost. We use local averaging within each grid cell, but we do include realistic thermodynamics. So we include the temperature and density relations and pressure relations for any formulation, and we can customize the thermodynamic property data for whatever formulation we like. We also allow for non-equilibrium thermodynamic states in the mixture. This is very important in the PMDI because as the flow goes through the orifice, it's accelerated to such speed that the flow does not have time to remain in thermodynamic equilibrium as it goes from pressure inside the metering chamber to atmospheric pressure outside. So by allowing for the non-equilibrium behavior, we get more realistic spray properties. And although we're not modeling the individual droplets and interfaces, our time average liquid and vapor distributions ought to match experimental data, and indeed we can show that they do that quite well. We also have to think about turbulence. We use an approach called large eddy simulation. Large eddy simulation captures the large turbulent coherent structures responsible for entraining warm humid air into the cold jet of propellant vapor. That's quite important for the development of the spray. And then anything that's smaller than the size of our grid, we use a model to capture the dissipation of that energy. Now this is in the literature. Most models for MDIs in the past have used Reynolds averaging, which doesn't capture these effects. And this is quite important, especially when it comes to water transport, as we'll show. We also use a population model called sigma y for our droplets and our spray formation, where we're conserving surface area. And we can compare then the size distributions from this to our Malvern Spraytech diffraction data to make sure that it's okay. As yet, what we don't have is a precipitation model for the particles, which means we can't predict fine particle fraction yet. But we could then couple our model in future to a DEM, for example, and actually get this. So it's something that we're working towards. So let's jump to the results now. Here's what you're looking at for a solution formulation. So we're going to consider as an example today a HFA 134A spray with a 15% ethanol co-solvent. And this is the density field, where red is high density liquid and blue is low density vapor. And the geometry is like so. We have a metering valve here where the fluid comes in from the metering chamber. We have an expansion chamber here. Here is our actuator orifice. And out here in blue is air at about 24 degrees C. So we can take our density field here and make sure that it's actually correct. So we'll take a slice of the density through the spray near to the nozzle, and it looks something like this, because we know the density everywhere in the simulation. And what we can then do is compare to X-ray absorption measurements that we made at the synchrotron in the last few years of this same spray with this same nozzle, and we can compare them. And if I blow up the figure so we can see it, we're looking at the simulation in green, and the red dots are our X-ray measurements. And you can see it's not a perfect agreement, but we're within a couple of micrograms per square millimeter of projected density. And so that's extremely promising that we're getting this good agreement. There's been no tuning to the experimental data here. We're just using the real thermodynamic properties of the mixture and putting it into our model without any adjustment or tuning to attempt to match this. So this is a blind result, and we're very happy with it. The next thing we can do is look at how the air mixes into the jet. So red here is the air, and blue is the cold propellant mixture. And we can compare that to our optical spray measurements, and we see that the cone angles match up pretty well. We can also then look at the velocity of the jet, and the velocity does something very interesting. Near to the nozzle, we get this rapid acceleration and deceleration that occurs not inside, but actually just outside the orifice. The flow rapidly accelerates and then decelerates, and the spray widens out very quickly and then stabilizes to a wider jet. This is a flash evaporation type process. In order to understand what's going on, we can then also calculate the speed of sound from our thermodynamic data, and we can plot the Mach number shown here. And the yellow region has a Mach number of about 0.35. In other words, in this region here, compressibility of the fluid actually becomes quite important. It's no longer sufficient to say that it's an incompressible fluid like most simulations do. You have to account for the compressibility in here to understand what's going on. So the droplets that are formed there are being squeezed and then rapidly pulled apart, and the spray is widening out very quickly. And this is quite important in determining the structure of the jet, of the spray plume. The other thing we can do is compare our experimental Sauter mean diameter from our droplet population model to an actual SMD measurement that we make optically. So this is the instantaneous SMD throughout the spray, and you can see that the respirable ones, which are going to be the green to blue colors, are on the edge of the spray as we would expect, and we get our larger droplets that haven't yet fully broken up and haven't started evaporating yet in the core. If we take the probability distribution of everything in the spray plume, we get a distribution that looks like this red line here, and we can compare that to our Malvern data in blue. And you can see that the red and the blue certainly don't look exactly like each other, but what's most important is that the SMD of the peak here, which is at about 6 to 7 micron, matches up really well with exactly what we see in our Malvern data. And the reason they don't look completely the same is because the Malvern can't measure anything really below about 5 microns in our particular machine. And so all this stuff down here has disappeared. It's been truncated. But very promisingly, we can see that the peak here and the peak in the red, they do match up very well in terms of the size on the horizontal axis here. So that's really promising. And again, so that's all really nice. But what can we get from this model that we couldn't get from a laboratory measurement? One of the things is the mixing and entrainment of water vapor from the air into the droplets and the potential for hygroscopic growth of the drug particles due to accretion of water onto the droplet surfaces. So, since we know where the air is and we know the temperature, and we can estimate, let's say, 100% relative humidity at 297 Kelvin, just as an example case, since we know that mixing and we know the temperature and the density, we can solve Fick's law of diffusion and determine what rate the water vapor in the air will diffuse through the propellant vapor onto the surface of the droplets. Now, this is just an estimate, but it gives us an approximate diffusion rate, and we can see that occurring throughout the spray. So this black-blue region here, that's where the condensation of water can occur because the temperature's below the dew point and there's enough water and air and propellant mixing with each other. They have to be mixing, and it has to be below the dew point. And it's a diffusion limited process because it can only happen so fast. So what we can do is then map that along the streamlines of the flow and answer the question, how fast will water from the humid air condense on the droplet surface? If we follow along the streamlines and integrate them, we can come up with a measurement, and we can see that we get a certain amount, about 30 nanograms per microliter of water on average ending up in our droplets. And since our concentration of our API is at about 1 microgram per microliter, we can see that it's relatively small in this case. But for the first time, we can actually estimate it. The other thing that we can do is evaluate new actuator designs. Here's the nozzle that I've already showed you, and we've been doing some work looking at double nozzle actuators. So here's a design that has 2 nozzles, same flow rate, same cross-section area, but 2 holes. And you can see that the jets merge with each other and form one new jet that has slightly different properties to this one. And we can compare how these behave in the model, and then we can do fine particle fraction measurements and experiments. And we can see in the experiment here that we get 1 jet and 1 jet, just like we do here. We get the mixing of the 2 jets, so that's quite good. And then the next thing we can do is compare to fine particle fraction data. So we can take the black here being this one here, and the green here being this one. And what we find is we get very large increases in fine particle fraction when we use multiple jets. Why is that the case? We can use our model to try and figure it out, because we have all the information about what the spray is doing here and the entrainment of the fine particles into the plume. So, in summary, this model that we're showing is really just a foundation that we can put more complexity on top of, and allows us to design a formulation and an actuator together in silicon before we actually build and test in the lab. So potentially it's a great cost saver. Although at this point we do still need a supercomputer to run the calculations, and it takes a couple of days to run a single case. So they are rather computationally intensive. But what we hope is that models like this will ease the transition to new low greenhouse potential propellants, because it allows us to test and design in the computer and get the design right before we go to the lab. There are many challenges ahead. We can't yet get the fine particle fraction exactly from the model, because we need a precipitation and drying model, but that's something that we want to work towards. So with that, I'll finish up, and I'd be happy to take any questions in the chat. Thank you for your time, and I'd like to acknowledge some of my collaborators here and also our funding support. Thank you.